The sheriff killed his engine but did not step out right away. He just sat there watching the dead marina behind Linda like he was trying to understand what he was looking at. The pump house horn echoed across the lake every 6 seconds now. Lower. Slower. Bad sign. One of the contractors wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced toward the shoreline transformers near the clubhouse. Smoke curled faintly from one of the vents. Not thick smoke. Just enough to make everyone stop pretending this was routine. Linda turned toward the sheriff first. Of course she did. "We are handling a code enforcement issue," she said quickly. "This dock was unauthorized and unsafe." The sheriff looked past her at the water. "Then why are half the marina systems offline?" Nobody answered him. The lake breeze shifted. I caught the smell of hot wiring and wet cedar drifting off the exposed pilings. The same smell I remembered from flood repairs after the Tennessee storms back in '93. My father used to come home soaked to the knees after midnight inspections. Mud on his boots. Coffee in a steel thermos. He built half the stabilization hardware around the shoreline when the county still cared more about engineering than luxury property brochures. Most people in Carrington Shores did not know that. Linda definitely did not. She bought her lakefront mansion 4 years ago after making a fortune selling vacation properties to Nashville investors. Then she became HOA president and started redesigning the neighborhood like she was staging homes for a magazine shoot. Dark docks had to become white composite. Fishing boats had to disappear after sunset. Old lake houses needed approved landscaping palettes. She even banned wind chimes because she called them low-class noise pollution. My dock was her favorite target. Not because it was dangerous, because it was old. Real cedar. Hand-built. Weathered silver by 30 winters. It did not match the fake perfection she wanted wrapped around the shoreline. A gull landed on the broken edge of the dock and screamed once before taking off again. The contractor nearest the crane finally spoke up. "Ma'am," he muttered toward Linda. "The pressure. Readings are still dropping." She snapped her head around. "Just finish the removal." But he did not move this time. None of them did. Across the marina, another sound rolled over the water. Metal gates locking. Then angry voices. The electronic marina access system had sealed itself shut after the backup relay failed. Homeowners were trapped inside the lower dock parking area with their trucks and boat trailers. I could hear someone pounding on the keypad box from nearly 200 yards away. Linda folded her arms tighter. Her confidence looked thinner now. Smaller somehow. The sheriff finally stepped out of his truck. Gravel crunched under his boots. "Walker," he said to me quietly, "you want to explain why county infrastructure alarms are tied to your dock?" I looked out across the water before answering. The lake had gone unnaturally still. No fountains. No moving lifts. No hum from the fuel pumps near the marina store. Even the big clubhouse flag hung limp without the usual vibration from the underground generators. That silence was the first thing that really scared people. Rich neighborhoods hate silence. Silence means systems stopped working. I walked past Linda toward the breaker post near the willow tree. The old county seal was barely visible beneath rust and moss. The sheriff saw it immediately. Linda did not. She was too busy yelling at the contractor to restart the crane. Then the emergency sirens started coming from the far side of the lake. The first county truck came flying down the shoreline road with yellow strobes flashing across the trees. Then another one followed behind it. Utility response. Water control division. I recognized the markings before the tires even stopped rolling over the gravel. The contractor backed away from the crane controls and pulled his gloves off slowly. He looked sick now. One of the HOA board members tried slipping away toward the clubhouse path, but the sheriff stopped him with a single look. The emergency sirens echoed across the lake again. Closer this time. Linda kept talking anyway. That was the strange part. Even with alarms screaming and half the marina dead behind her, she still sounded like she thought. Paperwork could overpower reality. "This property is under HOA Shoreline Authority," she snapped at the county workers as they stepped out of the trucks. "We filed all necessary notices." One of the older county inspectors ignored her completely and walked straight toward the exposed dock supports. Gray beard, sunburned neck, heavy boots wet from shoreline mud. His flashlight beam slid across the broken brackets and stopped on the steel anchor housing beneath the waterline. Then his entire posture changed. "Nobody touch anything else," he barked. The contractor froze in place. Even the crane operator killed the engine. The sudden silence hit harder than the sirens. Wind brushed through the cattails beside the shore. Somewhere across the marina, a dog started barking non-stop. The inspector crouched beside the old support frame and wiped algae off a metal plate bolted under the dock. I already knew what it said. My father made me help install that plate when I was 16 years old. County Flood Stabilization Node 3A. Protected utility structure. The inspector looked back at me sharply. "Walker," he said, "tell me they did not cut the relay housing." I glanced toward the floating section of dock drifting 20 feet from shore. The severed conduit pipe underneath it was still dripping lake water. "They cut through it about 10 minutes ago," I answered. Linda stepped forward immediately. "This is absurd," she said. "It is a private residential dock." The inspector stood up so fast his knees cracked. "Lady," he said, "that dock stabilizes pressure overflow for this entire marina basin." Nobody said a word after that. I watched the realization spread through the crowd one face at a time. The neighbors near the walking trail lowered their phones. One of the board members actually took a step backward like the shoreline itself had become dangerous. Across the lake, the clubhouse lights flickered weakly before dying completely. Then came another metallic boom from somewhere underground. Deep, heavy. The kind of sound infrastructure makes when backup systems fail in sequence. Linda looked at me finally instead of past me. Her makeup suddenly seemed too sharp for daylight, too perfect for the panic creeping into her eyes. "You knew this would happen," she said quietly. I looked out over the dead marina. I knew the county never disconnected the old stabilization grid. The inspector rubbed his forehead hard enough to leave mud across his temple. "We shut down 3 of these nodes after the floods," he muttered. "I thought this one was inactive." "It was," I answered, "until your replacement systems overloaded last summer." His eyes narrowed immediately. He understood before anyone else did. The old node under my dock had been carrying emergency pressure balancing for almost 8 months without public disclosure, which meant the county never reported the reroute, which meant somebody inside the utility department buried it quietly. The inspector stared toward the pump station with a completely different expression now. Then he reached for his radio. The inspector's radio crackled so loud everyone near the shoreline heard it. "Node failure confirmed," a voice said through static. "Pressure variance spreading across marina sectors 2 and 3. The older inspector closed his eyes for 1 second like he already knew his morning was ruined. Then he started barking orders fast. "Shut down fuel access. Lock secondary pump relays. Nobody touches this shoreline." County workers moved immediately. Not rushed. Focused. The kind of movement people make when they finally understand something expensive just broke. Linda stepped directly into the inspector's path. "You are overreacting," she snapped. This dock was condemned by the Homeowners Association. The inspector stared at her in complete disbelief. "Ma'am, your association just severed an active stabilization line connected to county overflow control." That sentence hit the crowd harder than the sirens had. I watched homeowners along the marina path slowly lower their coffee cups. Somebody whispered, "Overflow control?" Another person pulled out a phone and started recording again. But this time nobody was filming me. They were filming Linda. The breeze shifted colder across the lake. Clouds rolled over the water in thick gray strips, swallowing the morning sunlight. The marina looked different without the fountains running. Smaller, artificial, like a stage set after the electricity cuts out. I walked toward the broken edge of the dock while county workers unrolled cables beside the shoreline transformer box. One of them recognized me. "Walker," he muttered quietly. "You still got access to the old relay housing?" "Under the west support beam," I answered. "If the chamber flooded, the bypass probably locked itself." He nodded once and hurried off toward the pump station. Linda heard every word. "Bypass?" she repeated sharply. What bypass? I ignored her and crouched beside the exposed conduit pipe hanging from the torn dock section. Water dripped steadily from the severed line into the lake. Cold. Clear. The same sound I used to hear as a kid while helping my father inspect shoreline valves during storm season. Back then, this lake was mostly fishermen and retirees. No luxury marina. No gated paths. No matching stone mailboxes every 50 feet. My father hated what the neighborhood became before he died. He used to stand on this same shoreline holding a wrench in one hand and shake his head at the oversized lake houses spreading across the hills. These people think water is decoration, he told me once. Water always collects its debt eventually. Another loud metallic boom rolled through the marina basin. This one came from underground near the clubhouse fuel dock. Several homeowners jumped at the sound. A golf cart alarm started blaring near the parking area. Then came shouting from the lower marina entrance. The electronic gates had jammed completely shut. Families trying to leave for work were now trapped behind locked barriers with dead keypads and no power. Linda's face tightened hard enough to flatten her smile completely. Fix it, she demanded toward the county workers. Nobody answered her this time. The older inspector walked back from the shoreline carrying a dripping steel plate covered in algae and rust. He held it up toward the sheriff. Original county installation tag, he said grimly. This structure was never legally disconnected. The sheriff looked toward Linda slowly after hearing that. Really looked at her for the first time all morning. Did your board verify county clearance before authorizing removal? Linda opened her mouth. Nothing came out. That silence told everybody enough. A cold gust pushed across the lake hard enough to rock the floating dock section against the pilings. The broken beams knocked together with hollow wooden thuds. Then the inspector turned toward me again. Walker, he said carefully. How long before the backup basin fails too? The inspector's question hung over the shoreline for a full second before I answered him. Maybe 40 minutes, I said. Less if the overflow chamber already flooded. The county workers stopped moving for half a heartbeat after hearing that. Then everything accelerated at once. Radios crackled. Toolboxes slammed shut. 2 workers sprinted toward the lower pump station carrying emergency cable reels across their shoulders. The sheriff stepped away from the crowd and called someone on his phone in a low voice. Even the contractor looked pale now. Linda tried to regain control of the situation anyway. This is being exaggerated, she snapped loudly toward the gathering homeowners. The association followed procedure. Nobody looked at her. That was new. A woman near the marina path pointed toward the water instead. The lake level along the western retaining wall had started changing. Slow at first, just a few inches, but enough to expose a dark algae line beneath the stone edge. One of the county workers cursed under his breath when he saw it. The stabilization pressure was shifting unevenly through the basin now. I walked down the shoreline toward the old relay hatch buried beside the willow roots. Wet grass soaked through my jeans at the knees as I crouched beside the rusted cover plate. The metal felt ice cold under my hands. I had not opened that hatch since my father's funeral. The old county key still fit. Barely. Rust scraped loud against the lock cylinder before it finally turned. Linda followed me halfway down the slope in those spotless white shoes she should never have worn near mud. You knew this system was active, she accused. I pulled the hatch open. Damp air rolled out carrying the smell of lake water, machine oil, and old wiring insulation. I knew the county rerouted emergency pressure balancing last summer, I answered without looking at her. I did not know they buried the report. The chamber lights below flickered weakly. Red warning indicators blinked beside the relay valves in uneven patterns. Not good. One entire row had already shut itself down. The backup flow meter was shaking hard enough to rattle the metal housing. I heard footsteps sliding down the slope behind me. The older inspector leaned over the hatch and stared into the chamber. Dear God, he muttered. This node has been carrying the whole West Basin. I nodded once. Since July. His jaw tightened instantly. July was when the new luxury marina expansion opened. Bigger fuel docks. bigger electrical demand, bigger water circulation systems for all those decorative fountains and shoreline waterfalls Linda loved showing off during neighborhood tours. The county replacement grid never handled the extra load properly. So somebody quietly reactivated the old stabilization node under my dock instead of rebuilding the infrastructure the right way. Cheap fix, temporary fix, dangerous fix. And now half of it was floating in pieces 20 feet offshore because Linda wanted cleaner aesthetics for property listings. A loud burst of shouting erupted near the upper marina parking lot. I looked up sharply. 3 black SUVs had just pulled through the main entrance gates before the electronic systems locked completely. Men in county utility jackets stepped out carrying hardshell cases and rolled maps under their arms. Not local crews. Senior infrastructure response. The older inspector swore softly beside me. They brought division engineers. Linda heard that too. I watched her expression change again. Smaller now. Tighter. For the first time all morning, she looked less like a neighborhood queen and more like somebody realizing her paperwork could not outrun engineers. Across the lake, another row of shoreline lights failed all at once. Darkness spread along the marina docks in a slow chain reaction. Then every phone in the crowd buzzed simultaneously with the same emergency notification. The emergency alert lit up every phone screen around the marina at the exact same time. County Water Authority notice. Immediate restricted access for West Basin infrastructure failure. Homeowners started talking over each other instantly. Confused voices. Angry voices. Somebody near the clubhouse parking lot yelled that their garage doors would not open. Another man shouted about medication locked inside his boat locker because the electronic docks had shut down. The entire shoreline suddenly felt smaller and louder at the same time. Linda grabbed her own phone with both hands. Her face lost color as she read the alert twice. Then a second notification appeared underneath it. All marina operations suspended until further notice. That one hit harder. You could feel it. The wealthy homeowners standing around the lake all had the same expression now. Shock mixed with calculation. Boats trapped in slips. Fuel access frozen. Property tours canceled. Summer rentals dead in the water before noon. I climbed out from the relay hatch and wiped cold mud from my hands onto my jeans. The wind coming off the lake had picked up. Sharp, wet. It carried the smell of algae and overheated wiring from the shoreline transformers. One of the county engineers approached the hatch carrying rolled schematics under his arm. He looked about my age. Tired eyes. Steel gray beard starting to come in around the jawline. "You Ethan Walker?" he asked. "Yeah." He handed me a laminated diagram already spotted with rainwater. "Tell me if this reroute matches what your father installed." I looked at the diagram for maybe 3 seconds before my stomach tightened. It was worse than I thought. Somebody had not only reactivated the old stabilization node under my dock. They had expanded it. Quietly. Illegally. Temporary bypass lines now connected half the luxury marina additions directly through the original flood control chamber beneath my property. My father built that chamber to stabilize storm overflow after the '93 flood nearly washed out the western shoreline. It was never designed to support decorative water features, oversized fuel docks, and 300 vacation homes pretending to be a private resort. Who approved this reroute? I asked. The engineer gave a dry laugh without humor. That is what division wants to know. Linda overheard that immediately. The county approved every expansion permit, she snapped defensively. The engineer looked at her over the top of the map. Expansion permits are not the same thing as infrastructure authorization. That shut her up for exactly 5 seconds. Then why was this hidden under a private dock? She demanded. Nobody answered right away because the answer was obvious. Money, delays, politics. The county kept the old stabilization node active because rebuilding the shoreline system correctly would have cost millions and delayed the luxury expansion Linda had been advertising nonstop for the last year. A loud mechanical groan rolled across the marina. Every head turned toward the western retaining wall. Water was surging unevenly now against the stone edge. Not flooding yet, but wrong. The basin pressure kept shifting every few minutes as the damaged node struggled to compensate. One of the engineers started swearing into his radio. Sector 3 is dropping again. The older inspector pointed directly toward my shoreline. We need temporary relay access restored now. Another engineer shook his head hard. Not with the conduit severed. If we force pressure back through that chamber, we could collapse the overflow gate entirely. Linda stared at them like she had wandered into a language she did not understand anymore. Her authority was evaporating in real time. HOA rules meant nothing beside failing infrastructure. Then the sheriff walked back toward us holding a folder sealed inside a plastic evidence bag. Water dripped from the corners onto the grass. Found this inside the lower utility cabinet, he said quietly. The sheriff held the plastic evidence bag up against the gray morning light while rain started speckling the lake. Inside the bag sat a stack of folded county forms stamped Confidential Infrastructure Review. Every engineer near the shoreline went silent the second they saw the seal. The older inspector took the folder carefully like it might explode in his hands. Water dripped from his sleeves while he flipped through the pages. Then he stopped turning them. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered. Linda stepped forward immediately. "What is that?" Nobody answered her. The wind pushed harder across the basin now. Small waves slapped against the broken dock section drifting near shore. One of the severed support beams knocked against another with slow hollow thuds. The sound reminded me of old boats tapping together before storms. The inspector handed one page to the division engineer beside me. I caught enough of the text to understand exactly why their faces changed. Emergency Temporary Stabilization Authorization. Approved 8 months earlier. Signed quietly through County Utility Administration without public disclosure. My father's old node under my dock had officially become the primary backup stabilization system for the entire West Marina expansion. And nobody informed the homeowners because the permits for the luxury shoreline additions had already been sold to investors. The engineer looked at me sharply. "You never received notice?" I laughed once under my breath. Short, dry. The HOA spent 2 years sending me violation letters about weathered wood and fishing lights, I said. But nobody mentioned critical infrastructure. Linda's face hardened immediately. "That cannot be legal." The sheriff looked at her without much sympathy. "Ma'am, removing a protected utility structure without county clearance is definitely not legal." That landed hard. Around us, homeowners had stopped pretending this was some annoying neighborhood dispute. They were listening now. Really listening. A man in a rain jacket stepped toward Linda holding his phone out. "You told us the dock was abandoned," he snapped. "You said the county approved demolition." Linda opened her mouth carefully this time. Slower now. "We received shoreline compliance recommendations." "Recommendations are not authorization." The division engineer cut in coldly. Thunder rumbled far off beyond the hills. Low and heavy. The lake surface darkened another shade as the storm front moved closer. County crews had opened 3 utility cabinets along the shoreline by then. Flashlights flickered inside exposed relay boxes while engineers argued over pressure readings and emergency reroute options. One of them kicked the side of a transformer hard enough to rattle the housing. "Pressure variance keeps climbing," he shouted toward the inspector. "Sector 3 cannot hold much longer." The older inspector rubbed both hands over his face and looked toward me again. "Walker," he asked quietly, "how stable is the original overflow gate?" I stared out toward the western basin where the water line kept pulsing unevenly against the retaining walls. "Depends how badly the severed conduit damaged the balancing chamber." "Worst case." I took a breath. Rain hit the lake harder now. Tiny silver impacts everywhere. "Worst case," I answered. "The overflow gate locks open and drains half the marina basin into the lower channels." Nobody spoke after that. Even Linda finally stopped talking. The only sounds were rain tapping against dock pylons and distant alarms still echoing from the dead marina systems. Then one of the younger engineers came sprinting up the shoreline holding a soaked clipboard against his chest. He looked straight at the inspector. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "we found who signed the reroute approval." The inspector looked up sharply. "Who?" The young engineer swallowed hard before answering. Linda Carrington's husband. Rain hammered the lake hard enough to blur the shoreline lights into streaks across the water. Nobody spoke for a full second after the engineer said Linda's husband signed the authorization. Then the entire crowd erupted at once. Questions. Accusations. Angry voices bouncing across the marina basin. Linda looked like somebody had kicked the ground out from under her. "That is impossible," she snapped immediately, but her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The sheriff noticed it too. He slowly reached into the evidence bag again and pulled out the final page from the utility file. The signature sat right there at the bottom beside the county approval seal. Richard Carrington, Deputy Director of Utility Expansion. The division engineer exhaled through his nose hard enough to fog the rainwater on his glasses. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. They buried the overload problem under a private structure. Homeowners along the shoreline started backing away from Linda now instead of toward her. One woman in a blue raincoat pointed directly at the broken dock floating offshore. "You tore apart active county infrastructure because it looked ugly?" Linda turned toward the crowd with both hands raised. "Nobody knew the system was still connected." "Your husband knew," the sheriff answered flatly. "That shut everything down again." Rain tapped against the exposed relay hatch beside my knees while the county crews kept working around us. Flashlights cut through the gray storm light as engineers shouted pressure readings back and forth. One of the younger workers slipped in the mud near the transformer bank and barely caught himself against the railing. The basin pressure alarms had become constant now. No pauses anymore. Just one long metallic warning tone stretching across the marina like a siren inside a sinking ship. I looked toward the western retaining wall again. Water surged unevenly against the stone barrier every few seconds. Stronger now. The overflow gate beneath the basin was fighting to rebalance pressure through damaged lines never designed to carry this much load. The division engineer crouched beside the relay hatch and studied the shaking flow meter under the chamber lights. "Can the original node still stabilize if we reconnect the severed conduit?" he asked me. I stared at the floating dock section rocking against the pilings. "Not safely," I answered. "The support frame is gone." He rubbed rainwater off his forehead. "Then we are out of temporary options." Another deep metallic boom rolled under the marina, louder than before. Several homeowners gasped as the ground beneath the walking path vibrated slightly. The older inspector grabbed his radio instantly. "Pressure spike in Sector 3, somebody shouted through static. "Retaining wall sensors just triggered." The inspector turned toward the sheriff immediately. "We need full evacuation authority for the lower marina district." Linda stepped forward again, desperate this time. "You cannot evacuate the neighborhood over this." The sheriff looked at her like he was too tired to argue anymore. "Ma'am, your unauthorized demolition just compromised county flood control infrastructure tied to 300 occupied properties." The rain kept falling harder. Cold water dripped from Linda's hair onto her white blazer, streaking mascara beneath one eye. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Smaller than all those HOA meetings. Smaller than the violation letters taped to my mailbox over the years. One of the county engineers suddenly pointed toward the far side of the lake. "Look!" Every head turned. A thin line of water had started spilling through the western overflow channel beneath the retaining wall. Not a flood yet, just a narrow dark stream cutting through the concrete runoff trench toward the lower marina parking lots. But it should not have been moving at all. The older inspector stared at it for one long second before speaking into his radio again. "The gate is opening." The overflow gate opened another 6 inches with a grinding metallic roar that rolled across the entire marina basin. Water rushed through the concrete channel beneath the retaining wall in a dark, twisting stream. Homeowners started moving fast after that. Car doors slammed. Boat owners sprinted toward the locked marina gates, shouting into dead keypads that still had no power. Rain hammered the shoreline hard enough to bounce off the wooden planks scattered around my dock. The county engineers spread across the basin with radios pressed tight against their ears. One of them nearly slipped while dragging emergency cable toward the western control box. "Pressure loss accelerating," somebody yelled through static. The older inspector pointed toward the overflow trench immediately. Open the lower bypass channels before the retaining wall cracks. County crews rushed downhill toward the runoff controls. Linda stood frozen near the shoreline path while water soaked through her white clothes and ran in streaks across the concrete beneath her shoes. Nobody looked at her anymore. Nobody wanted explanations now. They wanted systems working again. I stepped back toward the relay hatch beside the willow tree and stared into the shaking chamber lights below. The old node was still trying to stabilize pressure despite half the support frame being torn apart. My father built that system to survive storms, not greed. But even old infrastructure has limits. The division engineer crouched beside me again. If we reconnect temporary flow manually, he said, can the chamber hold long enough to stabilize the basin? I looked at the severed conduit pipe floating near shore. Cold rainwater dripped steadily from the exposed lines into the lake. Maybe, I answered, but the dock has to be anchored back into position first. The contractor overheard that and stared at the floating structure offshore. With what support? He asked quietly. I pointed toward the original cedar pilings still buried under the shoreline mud. The supports are still there. They just cut the wrong section. The older inspector's expression changed instantly. He understood. My father designed the stabilization node with redundant anchor points hidden beneath the visible dock frame after the '93 floods. Even if the upper structure failed, the primary load-bearing pilings remained intact below the waterline. Linda's demolition crew had damaged the relay housing but missed the actual stabilization anchors completely because they never understood what they were cutting apart. The engineer stood up fast. Get the crane back online, he shouted toward the county crews. Now. The contractor hesitated only a second before running through the rain toward the barge controls. Engines roared back to life across the shoreline. Thick steel cables splashed into the basin, while county workers repositioned the floating dock section inch by inch toward the remaining anchor points. Every movement felt slow against the screaming alarms echoing around the lake. Water kept surging through the overflow channel beneath the retaining wall. But not faster anymore. Then came the sound I had been waiting for all morning. One sharp mechanical click from inside the relay chamber below my feet. The backup pressure gauge stopped shaking. The warning tone dropped lower, steadier. County engineers all looked at each other at once. Across the marina, one row of shoreline lights flickered weakly back to life through the rain. Then another. Homeowners standing near the parking lots started cheering before they even realized they were doing it. The overflow stream beneath the retaining wall slowed from a surge to a steady runoff. Not perfect, but controlled again. The older inspector let out a long breath and looked toward me through the rain. Your father saved this basin twice, he said quietly. I looked out across the lake at the floating cedar dock settling back against the original pilings, while county crews secured the stabilization lines beneath the water. Linda stood alone near the walking path with rain running down her face and sheriff deputies moving toward her husband's utility file beside the shoreline trucks. The marina lights reflected across the dark water again in broken silver streaks. Quiet, uneven, alive. My father would have hated what this neighborhood became, but his dock still outlasted all of them.